dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.TV. Thank you for joining me this evening. I kind of want to start off with this Iranian deal. And I'm going to start off with the Ron Paul Liberty Report. And I got another article from Truth and Media that I'm going to cover. But I kind of want to get started in this because this is one of the big things that's out there right now. So, I have the Ron Paul Liberty Report from, was this today or yesterday? Yeah, this was yesterday. Iran deal, peace opportunity or historic mistake?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Foss.
Well, there is some exciting news. There's been a move on for a couple of years now to have some type of an agreement with the Iranians and sort of breaking the ice, break through, and at least talk to the Iranians, which I always favored and we've talked about. That is, when I woke up this morning very early from Europe, the president was speaking, talking about reaching, a deal with the Iranians, and this involved 6 major countries, U.S. and U.K., France and Germany, as well as China and Russia. Isn't that interesting? I thought we were trying to provoke China and Russia, but they at least sat down and worked this out, and there's a deal. Now, on the surface, it won't be hard to find out who will love the deal. Maybe nobody will love the deal, but at least satisfied with it. And which ones will become nearly hysterical. There is a group of people in this country, I claim they're terrified about peace breaking out. And that, of course, are the radical neocons. And I imagine we've already heard from them. They're probably not going to be too happy with this little agreement.
Well, our favorite Senator Tom Cotton said it was a stunning historic mistake. And his buddy across the ocean, Bibi Netanyahu, said it would, quote, lead to nuclear war.
I wonder how that will happen when, more so now than otherwise. It seems like if they were very concerned about nuclear weapons breaking out and they wouldn't go to a country that really they haven't ever proved that they've broken the rules on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there are other countries in the Middle East that seem to be antagonistic. Take one for Pakistan. I mean, they're not exactly the calmest country in the world, and they have nuclear weapons. So it's a lot of demagoguery. But what I find interesting is how these players come together. I said that, it's surprising that Russia and China joined in on this. But when you think about us working with the Iranians right now, the Iranians are fighting ISIS, and that is good. but we're on the opposite side when they want to get rid of Assad. So this thing just is all mishmash, all over the place, but nobody seems to say, well, we have to just do this and do that, and we'll improvise. If there's a problem here, we'll send troops here, or we'll switch sides. Look how many times they switch sides with the good guys in Syria, with the rebels. You know, one time we're with them, and the next time we're against them.
I was just listening to something the other night. It was a replay of something that President George W. Bush said, which is that the Taliban are a bunch of terrorists. We have no choice but to destroy them. And then someone from this administration said they refused to call them terrorists, and said they were armed fighters or something. So it really is, on the one hand, the U.S. wants to be, or some people in the U.S. want to be the world hegemon, to tell the rest of the world what to do. But on the other hand, it has no consistent policy. Even if the other countries were willing to follow its every dictate, they wouldn't know what to do from one day to the next.
The president made a good point. I didn't hear the whole speech, but most of it, and read a little bit more about it. But the one point I did listen to him, I thought made good sense. And that was when he was explaining that you don't always just talk to your friends. We don't need to have this conversation with the Canadians. It wouldn't make any sense. You talk to people that are potential enemies or even enemies. And he points out that we had weapons agreements, and Reagan, the champion of the conservatives, worked out deals with the Soviets, not the Russians, the Soviets, and backed off on some of this weaponry. So he was claiming this was a good sign, and I remember very clearly, which I've mentioned many times, is that when in the 1960s I was drafted into the military, but I wasn't exactly unhappy that there was a conversation between Kennedy and Khrushchev, even though there's some pros and cons on exactly the way that conversation went. But the net result was the weapons were taken out, and we made some promises. At the time, the promise was we'd take missiles out of Turkey. And I know they had to keep it secret because they thought the people would go nuts. Yeah. But logic would say, well, that's not a bad trade-off. Why do we have to have weapons in Turkey? At the same time, we complain about the Soviets having weapons in Cuba. So conversation with these people, it can't hurt. And a little bit of diplomacy, it can't hurt us at all. Now, of course, this isn't the end of it. The Congress, majority in Congress, I think, are controlled by the neocons and the anti-diplomacy group. And they have sworn practically an oath that they are going to stop it and vote it down. And rightfully, the Congress has a responsibility to come. Some could make an argument, and I think about this, is maybe something like this could have been a treaty. But how do you work with 6 countries on a treaty against UN sanctions and all these other things? You can't do it. So I think that this thing, is going to go to the Congress. It'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Well, in a way, the U.S. foreign policy created a problem that you've described, because the U.S. wanting to make it look like the entire world was aligned against Iran, they went to the UN and pushed the UN to adopt sanctions on Iran. So they have to go back to the UN to get those done. The other thing I think that's a danger is that people will misinterpret what happened and think of it as a deal, which has been called a done deal, when in reality it's a process. It's even called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So this is a process that will take place over a number of years. It's not, right now this will happen. And I think the people who want to detract and want to scuttle this treaty are going to misinterpret it.
It's a long way from the principles that would be developed between 2 sovereign nations, and the president negotiates and it goes to the Senate for ratification. But we're so far removed from that. This is the best thing we can use in order to move a little bit away from this confrontation. But this has been going on for a long time, and if the American people were honest with themselves, they would have to say, who started this fight? Who started it? Well, we'd have to look at our policies in 1953 and the overthrow of an elected leader in Iran and installing a very, very vicious dictator, the Shah, and then, of course, which helped radicalize those individuals that said, let's get rid of these puppets. And then the 79 revolution occurred, and that happened. But as the years went on with the use of UN, and the last decade or so, we have ratcheted up more and more sanctions. And sanctions, prohibitions of trade, and, freezing of assets. Do you think they froze like a couple $1,000, a couple $1 million, a couple $100 million? $100 billion with sanctions. If anybody did that, it would be an act of war, and every American would join in and say, we fight, we go to it. But when a big country does this, it's supposed to be moral and correct because those are bad people and we are righteous people, and we know exactly what we're doing.
And that's why I think those of us who very highly value the idea of sovereignty and national sovereignty shouldn't be overjoyed about this deal as such. If it moves us further away from war, that's a positive thing. But if you're in favor of sovereignty, Iran has been forced to give up a large amount of its sovereignty in exchange for having these sanctions removed. It will have inspectors running through the country. It'll have to regulate which of the reactors can do how much. It can't enrich to a medical level of isotopes on its own now. So it's given up a lot, even though it is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Well, that's key. When you deal with international economic issues, like that little minor thing going on in Greece and the European Union, the settlement was, many who are well informed say, the Greeks gave up their sovereignty. So we have these international bodies that we get control, we mislead them, give them bad economic advice, create a lot of credit, put them on the hook, and then when there's a problem, then we demand that the IMF economic policy have to be imposed. If not, we're going to let you just float out to sea. So it is the idea and principle. In that regard, you'd say this is not enhancing national security, but in the meantime, if we can take one step away from, the policy that said, nothing is taken off the table, is implying that if you don't behave, we'd even use a nuke on you. And that's been around by the Democrats and the Republicans. So that still exists as well.
Yeah, members of the Institute's board, Flint and Hillary Leverett, who are both professors in Washington, they make a great point. You mentioned how Obama has talked about we need to talk to our enemies, which is a great point. But they pointed out that even though the Americans have been consistently in favor of dialogue with Iran and even a deal, that Obama's big mistake, they say, is that he never came to the American people and explained why it's to our advantage, our strategic advantage, why we're better off having a deal with Iran and getting rid of this confrontational posture.
Well, I have a theory about that. If he doesn't think that we should know what's in a bill with medical care and that the people might not be wise enough or intelligent enough to find out what it's all about and make their own decision, they just ram it through. And they use executive orders rather carelessly. So they're elitists in the political sense at the worst, under the worst circumstances. But, one complaint by the neocons will be, they're going to be able to buy weapons. Well, not for 5 years, I think. It's not like tomorrow they're going to order weapons and they say, yeah, they're going to buy them from the Russians. But you know what? I have a suspicion that there's a few U.S. arms dealers that probably are licking their chops and saying, hey, they're going to get their $100 billion back and we're going to be allowed to sell weapons. In 5 years, maybe we'll start producing, for that. So there could be a little bit of that. I don't think our weapons industry have the scruples to say, oh, no, we'll practice a little bit of our own diplomacy. Why should we make a living selling weapons to people that a lot of people are fearful of?
Yeah, because we're the only ones allowed to sell weapons around the world. The other thing the neocons will say, when it finally the realization sets in that, oh, no, there's nothing we can do to stop it, here's the last thing they're going to say with their last breath. This just proves that sanctions work. It brought them to the table and brought a deal.
The one thing about what we're dealing with here and the inconsistencies, the inability to look at something precisely based on a principle, is the fact that we have shifted around to accepting the principle of interventionism, both in foreign policy and economic policy. Interventionism is a convenient tool for people to do whatever they want and not have to follow any precise moral imperative, and they can be very pragmatic, and so that you can support the same group, the same country for one war and be opposed to them against another war. Nobody even thinks about it. But interventionism permits this, and this is why the chaos that we have, not only in economics, because we have economic interventionism, but the interventionism in foreign policy has created this monster too. I think sovereignty is an important issue. The most important sovereignty is the sovereignty of the individual, and all rights should be individual, and keep it as close to the individual as possible. But then when you talk about governments, get government as close to home as possible. And then if you have to have a national sovereignty, maybe. But let's not decide that everything has to be done internationally under interventionism, and whoever's in charge, and whoever has the power to regulate things and get the benefits will, deal the cards. I think that's what we're putting up with. The total and final solution to that is for we as Americans to stand up and say, non-intervention is what we want. It is the road to peace and prosperity, and we can't depend on these international organizations and agreements. But in the meantime, the only thing left for us right now is to practice diplomacy. So if we see an opening, a door, a movement in that direction with Iran, that is great. The same thing we can say in a positive way is with Cuba. So those individuals who are terrified with the fact that you might have a little bit of dampening of this confrontation should be called to task, because they're wrong. And I think if we want peace and prosperity, we have to change the nature of our foreign policy. And I, of course, vote for non-interventionist peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report on Okay. Now I'm going to cover this article here. Not taking calls right this minute, so if you hold on, I will open the phone lines here. But I have one here out of Truth to Media, the 6 most problematic statements in Obama's Iran speech. Obama gave an optimistic speech Tuesday morning, hailing a newly reached nuclear deal with Iran as a historic accomplishment. Many have praised the new deal, and there's a near universal hope in the West that will be successful in its goal of halting Iranian nuclear ambitions. Still, many have expressed doubts about parts of the deal, and Obama's speech glosses over areas of the deal that warrant significant scrutiny. We parsed Obama's optimistic speech to add context. Number 1, because of this deal, inspectors will also be able to access any suspicious location. Put simply, the organization responsible for the inspections, the IAEA, will have access where necessary, when necessary. The Associated Press acknowledges that most observers consider the inspections regime a victory for Iran. Any request by UN inspectors to visit an Iranian nuclear site may be contested, with the visit approved by the Joint Commission consisting of representatives from each party to the Iran deal. The approval process could be rejected, and even if approved, allows a potential window of 24 total days prior to international intervention, giving Iran significant time to conceal any violations of the deal. It's now more than 50 years since President Kennedy stood before the American people and said, "Let's never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." He was speaking then about the need for discussions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which led to efforts to restrict the spread of nuclear weapons. Even Obama's fellow Democrats are wary of comparing this deal with past nuclear negotiations. David Rothkopf, CEO of FP Group, which publishes foreign policy, and a Democrat until recently, has warned that relating this deal to those with the USSR is folly. Number 3, as Iran takes steps to implement this deal, it will receive relief from the sanctions that we put in place because of Iran's nuclear program. If Iran violates the deal, all these sanctions will snap back into place. This snapback of sanctions, should Iran violate the deal, are kept part of the agreement, or a key part of the agreement, but reimposing them could be tougher in practice than in theory. As pointed out by the Wall Street Journal, there is huge interest in both the energy industry and elsewhere to invest in Iran and build substantial business operations. These groups will have strong incentives to lobby against reimposing sanctions. Plus, as Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic argues, even if sanctions return the deal, the idea of a true snapback is a fiction. The U.S. could reimpose sanctions on Iran if Tehran cheats on the deal, but it would be reimposing these sanctions on what will be a much richer country, one that could withstand such sanctions for quite a while. Today, because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region. Experts, including some of the U.S. government, are already warning that whether Iran's nuclear capacity is restricted or not, today's deal is unlikely to stop the ongoing race for nuclear capacity in the Middle East. Quote, the rhetoric isn't changing, unquote, one official told NBC News. He warned that major regional powers like Turkey and Egypt are skeptical of the deal and still believe Iran wants a bomb. As a result, they may try to start their own nuclear programs. Others warned that Saudi Arabia, which helped fund Pakistan's nuclear development, could try to call in its IOU by asking for one of Pakistan's bombs, or at least assistance with nuclear technology. The one likely way the U.S. could avoid proliferation would be to make strong military guarantees for every country in the region, something experts told NBC is unlikely with the declining U.S. presence in the region, which U.S. presence in the region is not going to help anything. Five, this deal has the full backing of the international community. Not true, whatever the opinions of other leaders. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been absolutely apologetic over the deal, calling it a mistake of historic proportions and aggressively blasting it over Twitter. Number 6, because of this deal, Iran will remove 2/3 of its installed centrifuges, the machines necessary to produce highly enriched uranium for a bomb, and store them under constant international supervision. Iran will not use its advanced centrifuges to produce enriched uranium for the next decade. Iran will also get rid of 98% of its stockpile of enriched uranium. The statement is accurate, but it glosses over key concessions the U.S. has made to Iran. Its heavy water plant at Iraq, used to make plutonium, is to be redesigned to limit its weapons potential, but it won't be dismantled. Its underground Fordo enrichment plant also remains operational, though it's supposed to be converted to peaceful purposes. Not only are facilities allowed to remain open, but Iran is allowed to continue certain nuclear research. For example, the deal allows Iran to conduct R&D on new types of centrifuges, and they only even have to seek permission if they plan to produce working prototypes for the new design they create. So you can check that out. I found that at truthandmedia.com, the 6 most problematic statements in Obama's Iran speech. Now, we always talk about this, we hear the discussion, they can't have a bomb, they'll blow it. We somehow think that, you know, because there are crazy people out there in these other countries that are crazy, we tend to let that get to our head, I guess, and we have a large amount of people that believe that, you know, well, Iran will try to nuke someone, and I Iran's not stupid. They know other people have nukes. The moment they even launched one, there would be missiles headed towards them. And even though there might be crazy people that are suicidal, do we really believe that the powers to be in Iran are suicidal while they're living in luxury? We have crazy people in other countries that do have nuclear weapons. Why don't they launch theirs? Because there's an understanding. When one goes off, another one goes off. It's just, we understood this during the Cold War. It was even admitted, you know, by the Soviets about, you know, Cuba talking about, you know, saying Castro was nuts because he was willing to do that. And, you know, no one really was willing to push a button. Why? Because the end result leaves no one a winner. But when you're the one that has a gun pointed at you with no way to point a gun back, you're left unarmed. It's natural for people to seek protection. That's a natural, you know, right. The right to self-defense. And it's really hypocritical for one country that has nuclear bombs to tell another country they can't protect themselves and have that where, you know, you can't bomb us because we could bomb you right back type thing. And you know, I just wish there was a way to just come up with a solution that makes that nuclear option impossible. But, you know, it's a fact of life. And hopefully it never goes to something like that because, you know, I forget who said it, but someone said that, you know, the Third World War would be fought with nuclear weapons, and World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. So we have a situation where the nuclear option, for anyone to seek it, it's not a great thing. There is nothing great about seeking a nuclear option. But it can also be seen as a response of other people gaining nuclear weapons, stockpiling nuclear weapons, and then holding another person basically at gunpoint, which sanctions are that. And we shouldn't praise the creation of more nuclear weapons in this world, but we shouldn't also punish countries that don't even have that while we're running around the world with the ability to have nuclear weapons. So you still just have to look at it as a response. And you know, people go, we that's why we need sanctions and all this, but many fail to realize that doesn't stop the regime. It doesn't stop them. The North Korean president or leader or whatever you want to call that guy, he doesn't, live in poverty. He still gets to live a lavish lifestyle. It hurts the little man, and for us to impose sanctions with everything we do around the world, and even what we've done in the history of Iran, we really don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to that. Now, we'll come back to this later on in the broadcast. I do have quite a long clip here. I'm probably not going to play it all, but I do want to play a majority of it. But it's Jeffrey Tucker, Liberty Classics from liberty.me, on socialism. And since it seems that we're headed in this direction, that socialism is somehow an acceptable principle to enact in government, I think is the lack of understanding the difference between a voluntary socialist type environment where you're allowed to help people out. It's becoming it's outlawed that you give homeless people food, but you should pay more and more and more to the government so they can help the little person out, which the little person is still on the street corner while they're flying around in their jets and taking 12 vacations a year or whatever, and they get to live a lavish lifestyle. That's what happens when you take government and the idea of socialism and combine them. It becomes a fascist type scenario. But I'm going to play this clip here, and I will open the phone lines in the second hour. So just hold on, and we'll get to it here.
Welcome, Liberty Meers. I'll wait just a second. Let's see. I'll type in the chat window here. Okay. Let me just say then at the outset that good. Okay. Let me just say at the outset that any questions you have, I think I'm prepared to open up to look at them in the chat window, and we can discuss things if you'd like to. First of all, let me apologize for my bright red face. Concerned about vitamin D deficiency. I went outside in the sun today. I thought, well, maybe it's time to get a little bit of sun, you have to do that from time to time. It's good for your health. And then I was out there maybe 30, 45 minutes, something like that. And it was like being in an oven or something. It was just it's just insane. Just how much the sun just like instantaneously baked my face. I guess I hadn't been out enough or something, but it's just crazy. I'm looking at myself going, oh my God, So I don't know. I think it was like 100 degrees out there or something today, but pretty insane. So I've got some hydrocortisone. I'll put it on, and I'm sure I'll be all fine in the morning. But for now, I'm a little bit toasted, a little bit disoriented. So Memorial Day weekend, right? Okay, so tonight we're talking about absolutely one of my favorite books in the history of the world, called Socialism, by Ludwig von Mises. And I would like to do it not just by talking about socialism alone, which I've done actually many times in the course of these seminars. Everybody knows that it's one of my favorite books. In fact, I think it's far more significant a work than people get a bit credit for being. One of the problems is that people typically regard this book as nothing but an attack on socialism. And so if you already disagree with socialism and you think it's terrible, there's no reason for you to read this book. What people don't understand is that actually, in fact, Mises offers a full-blown theory of of politics and a full theory of social life and the organization of society within this book. And it's an extremely advanced theory. There's some points that he makes in the book that he never returns to again in his career. I have no idea why that is. I would say in some sense it's his most speculative, most, how do I put it? It's the book that he was a very young man when he wrote it. So he was very intense about all the newest scholarship, and he writes it with a level of passion that's actually quite extraordinary from the beginning to the end. As I say, I'm not sure why this is, but he offers a series of insights concerning social life, the family, the origin of property, the origin of the state, the nature and structure of human association, that for some reason he never really returns to. In fact, this book offers, I think, Mises's really only full-blown treatment of the topic of the origin of property that he does in any of his work. The rest of it, he just takes private property for granted, describing its utility, but never returns to this question about where it came from. And herein he also deals with the origin of the state and really wonderfully fundamental questions. I mean, there's a sense in which if he had never written anything other than this book, he also deals, extensively with things like, family, human sexuality, psychoanalysis and psychology, religion's basis. He has some very speculative thoughts about religious doctrine, about religious mysticism, syndicalism, intellectuals and socialism, just wonderful, sweeping stuff. It'll keep you busy for weeks, really, this book. I was about to say, if he had never written anything but this book, if it had been the culmination of his career, and he had gone on, and he had died or something, or retired, then it would have been enough to establish his name in the history of the social sciences. Of that, there's absolutely no question. In some sense, I think it's a kind of a tragedy that this book has been overshadowed by things like Human Action, because it's that level of book. I mean, the upshot of the book is that, of course, that it gives a devastating, sweeping, all-encompassing case against socialism that you read and you never really recover from. Now, I'm assuming, most of us are not socialists. We think socialists are ridiculous and they're gone from the world today. So maybe that would make you think you don't need to read the book. But in Mises's day, almost everybody in academia was a socialist, at the University of Vienna. So he was really taking on the establishment in this big way. And he shocked many people. F.A. Hayek writes about what it was like for him, who was just basically a run-of-the-mill socialist like everybody else. And he read the book and he never quite recovered from it. He rejected socialism and never returned to it again. And it made a whole generation feel deeply uncomfortable, actually, with their preset ideological structures. And, Mises had also made himself kind of, through this book, an enemy of a vast number of people. There were three main groups that he had become the enemy of. One was the professional philosopher class and the economists, the intellectuals, the academic elite in all over Europe, in the UK and the US. That was his primary target, of course, because he himself is an intellectual. Secondly, by taking on religion and the socialist mystics and the people who dream of creating a new world through fanciful imaginings of a spiritual nature, he took them on. Particularly, he took on early trends in Catholic and Protestant forms of socialism in the 1920s. So he made himself an enemy of the clerical class of the day. And then thirdly, he took on states and statesmen and politicians who, were fond of whipping up dreams of pure democracy, the abolition of private property and socialist revolution as a means of giving themselves power. Mises saw straight through this and took it on directly, and really showed that socialism was really just a kind of a, for this class of citizens, just a masquerade, a kind of just a pretext for dictatorship. So those are the three groups that he took on: the philosophers, the religious mystics, and the tyrants. And he did it in an all-encompassing way by laying out a full theory of society, the division of labor, the origin of property rights, the origin of the market economy, the workings of the market economy, the justification of the family, which of course every socialist at the time, was convinced that the family was an evil thing that had to be abolished, as Marx said in the Communist Manifesto. And this is very common. So he came to the defense of the family as an institution, and went into great depth on drawing mainly from the work of Freud, actually, in defense of gender roles as an extension of sexual biological realities, and then went on to attack every conceivable form of socialism, and just the book was amazing, and it blew people away. It was debated for something like 20 years. In particular, the thing that came under most intense debate after the book came out was his claim that socialism was unrealistic, literally, in the sense that it was inconsistent with the realities that were necessary for a civilized life. And his argument went like this. In order to have rational economic calculation, you had to have the ability to assess the opportunity costs of all the uses of resources. Whether something where some resource, whether steel or oil or paper or labor, should be used for this task or for that task. There's nothing about the nature of the world that really necessarily tells you whether or not that's true. The central planners don't automatically know, what the answer to that is. The answer is provided to us by the system of profit and loss. When things begin to lose money, when whole industries and sectors begin to lose money, that's a signal that the resources are being incorrectly used. When they make money, it's a sign that they're being used right. But in order to calculate profit and loss, you have to have prices. Prices are a way of aggregating the prevailing realities concerning human values and relative scarcities of resources. But in order to have accurate prices, you had to have real life trading. You had to have people actually exchanging things, buying and selling things from each other in order to establish real existing prices. But you can't buy and sell, you can't trade in absence of private property. So that's the way his chain of logic ran. So in absence of private property, then you don't get accurate prices. In absence of accurate prices, you have nothing you can use to calculate profit and loss. Without profit and loss signals, you lack the ability to calculate rationally. And without the ability to calculate rationally, you're just randomly assigning resources, to whatever kind of, based on political priorities or whatever, leading to total economic collapse, irrationality, and universal disaster. In fact, he predicts in here that under full-blown socialism, which he thinks is actually impossible, civilization would die out, very quickly. And any attempts to move towards socialism move us away from prosperity, rationality, efficiency towards inefficiency, statism, and decivilization. That's the way he argued. And it's quite a devastating challenge, because it said literally to the socialists, you can dream whatever you want. You can have all the high-flying theories you want, but in the end, you've got to figure out a way to make an economy actually function like an economy. And without private property, there is no economy. There's just none. You just have dictators randomly shuffling resources around. The socialists and the free market people debated this subject for essentially 25 years between 1922 when this book came out and the late 1940s. And ironically, it was widely assumed within the literature that Mises had lost the debate in favor of the so-called market socialists who imagined they could make up phony prices to substitute for this problem. Oscar Longa very famously said that he should erect a statue to Mises in Poland because it was Mises that alerted the socialists to the key problem of economic calculation in a socialist commonwealth and led them to come up with a brilliant solution. Of course, the solution was not a solution, as Mises said in many of his later writings. And that seems very obvious to me when you read Mises's one chapter in here on economic calculation, that he makes a very decisive case. So that's the most famous part of the book. But I don't think that it's all that's in this book. In this book, you'll find a complete social theory. As I've urged people on this program before, you'll be particularly interested in two chapters really like that appear in the first third of the book. One is on the origin of property, where you get a theory of property rights that is not based in sort of Lockean homesteading and the idea of mixing your labor with things. That's just not part of Mises' theory of property at all. You get a completely different origin of property. Growing out of, he sees property as a kind of as an invention, a technology that was established in order to solve the problem of privation. And I think, I've thought about this quite a lot, that Mises is actually realistically and historically correct about this. I mean, Mises was very interested in this book and always grounding his theory in historical reality and facts about the world. I mean, his big problem with socialism is it seemed like a far-flung fantasy based on essentially nothing. Nothing realistic, nothing hard, nothing true. And he was always anxious in this book constantly to drive the readers back to the facts of reality, whether it's biological facts, certain physical facts about the scarcities in the world and the need for property to allocate resources, all kinds of historical experiences with socialism, all these things. He's constantly popping everybody's bubbles, right? I mean, this is what he's doing. He's blowing away fantasy and trying to ground your assessment of political and social realities in true functioning of the world, the way the world actually exists. So this is his sort of nonstop way that he argues from the beginning of the book all the way to the end. So what I'd like to do now is draw attention to a parallel, which I think is actually very close. And the parallel is with Aristotle's great book called Politics. And I don't know how many of you ever read it, but you can download it very quickly if you just Google Aristotle's Politics in EPUB. It'll come up for you very quickly. It's a mighty and interesting and brilliant book. If you think Aristotle's intimidating or scary and you don't know anything about it, forget all that. Just go to the internet, download the EPUB, spend an evening with it. You'll find it absolutely fascinating. He's a very clear writer, very clear thinker. But there's so many parallels between Aristotle's Politics and Mises' socialism. They overlay each other very, very well. Let me caution you here that, I mean, Mises is obviously a much better thinker. I don't know about thinker, but he was much more correct, right? So with Mises as a post-Enlightenment thinker, living in the age of science, early 20th century, advocate of universal human rights, universal enlightenment, democracy under the rule of law, an opponent of all forms of despotism, particularly slavery. So that was not, of course, true of Aristotle. Writing in the 4th century BC, this is a world of hierarchies, of state religions, of the subjugation of women and of course, pervasive slavery and what we would call despotism and tyranny. So that was Aristotle's world. Aristotle doesn't go nearly far enough in taking on these institutions. I mean, there was no notion of this idea of realizable universal human rights, much less universal freedom or liberalism, really, what we call liberalism, which I would sum up as being the insight that society can manage itself without top-down control. I mean, Aristotle was not in any sense a liberal. I mean, to understand this, he lived many years before there was an enlightened understanding of the case against slavery, the case for universal rights, free speech, freedom of religion. These were none of this stuff was known in Aristotle's time. So when you take there's also, I mean, there's plenty of egregious things in Aristotle. He doesn't understand the first thing at all about money making and wealth. I mean, he ridicules the idea of making money. He doesn't essentially think it's possible to make money. He's especially down on usurers and bankers and people who exchange money for profit. I mean, he condemns this as inherently unjust. He thinks that a much better, like his conception of economics is essentially, I guess you could say, the opposite of Mises's in a way. He thinks that to grow wealthy is evidence that you've acquired wealth from somebody else. So for him, there's always a fixed pie. There's a certain amount of wealth in the world, and the only way to really get it is by taking it from somebody else. Acquisition, he calls it. Acquisition ends up being basically his case for war, which he loves war. He thinks that all children ought to be prepared for war. They should be prepared to be soldiers. And that soldiering is a very high profession. The purpose of a war is to go out and get wealth. There's no conception of what it meant to have a rising economy. I mean, his conception of trading is funny. He sees it as just people moving stuff from here to there and back again. Just basically a pointless exercise. He condemns retail trade, by name, and has a very low regard for merchants, who he thinks are, more or less very low figures. Artisans, he doesn't have any regard for them. No surprise, special pleader Aristotle was, as was all the philosophers of the time. He thought philosophy was the most important profession. I mean, philosophers are more important than statesmen, or freemen, or the aristocracy. It's certainly more important than the merchants and the retailers and the usurers. Way down at the bottom, the average merchants. Women occupy a very strange place because they're very high regard for women as in their biological function, very low regard for women as citizens and contributors to the social order. Children are essentially have no rights whatsoever. Education, in Aristotle's view, is obviously the job of the state. And then, of course, slavery. He can't even imagine a world without slavery. In fact, time and again in this book, he makes arguments against things like, should philosophers learn to be artisans too? Should we trade professions? Should statesmen also be farmers? Should people move around and change jobs and move amongst the castes? And his answer to that is no, that's ridiculous, because once we start that kind of thing, then we're going to lose all distinctions between the types of people in society, and eventually we could even lose the difference between master and slave. And if that happens, I mean, Aristotle just takes it as a given that that's the end of the end. Without slaves, nothing can work. So you might be thinking, well, what is it you like about this book then? I mean, what's so great about it? Well, there are many things that are great about it. I mean, one is his method, which is very much like Mises's. He's very interested in the facts of reality. He's super attached to the idea of the real world. He won't have anything to do with mystical dreams and abstract, free-floating concepts and forms and reflecting on, what the heavens are saying to you or whatever. He was interested in logic and interested in reality, always. That's his method. And he never stops. I mean, from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, he's really focused on what is true around us. He never departs much from the realities of the real world, which is inspiring and great, and probably to that generation of intellectuals a blessed relief. The second great thing in the book is a thoroughgoing and beautiful and really in many ways inspired defense of, you guessed it, private property, just like Mises. So he's passionate about the subject. In fact, to me, this is the part of the book. There are many aspects of the book that are wonderful and egregious, but brilliant too. But this is probably the best part, his very powerful defense of property. Now, granted, his defense of property is compromised by the fact that he thinks that women, slaves, and children are themselves should be considered property. Okay, true. So he's confused, about what are the standards of what is and isn't property. Which, by the way, libertarians to this day are not entirely secure on that subject. What is and isn't property. So to some extent, I tend to, I think we should be somewhat forgiving of Aristotle in this respect, since most libertarians today don't even get this right, as far as I'm concerned. I'm speaking to those in the know over the ongoing disputes concerning intellectual property. So we can't get that right. We still don't have a good conception of what is property. But nonetheless, he defends the idea of private ownership in a very beautiful way. So he starts by saying, in absence of private ownership, we can never refer to things like my child, my mother, my father, my sister, my brother. The whole conception of what is mine gets cut out completely. Under collective ownership, there's no such thing as mine. So there's no such thing as individuality in absence of ownership. So we wouldn't even have the word my in our language. And I feel sure, actually, by the way, that Ayn Rand, who quite frequently credited Aristotle with many of her views, took her position on ownership and individuality from Aristotle. I mean, I don't know this for sure, but he speaks very much in the vein that she's talked about. That in absence of private property, there's no sense of mine and yours, and I and you. The divisions between people, just gone completely. So there's that. Then he goes further to say that in absence of property, there can't be any such thing as giving to others. So if you don't own anything and nothing is really yours, you can't actually be benevolent to other people. You can't give them gifts. You can't take care of others. So in the absence of the physical possibility of being generous to other people, the generosity in spirit goes away completely. So benevolence is abolished, generosity of spirit is gone, and you reduce society to a sort of a very grueling state. I mean, this is Aristotle's prediction. And then he goes even further to say that in absence of private property, you won't have such things as love, since he says there's nothing that inspires a man or a person to love and care and to feel emotional attachments towards things like private ownership and privately owned things, private property. That this is what gives life to the human imagination. It's what gives us the desire to protect things, and to care for them, and to love them. So in absence of private property, Aristotle predicts there'll be a complete absence of love. So you can see here that there's a certain parallel in different forms, different times. I mean, these books are, essentially 2,300 years apart, right? But nonetheless, you have a kind of a parallel argument. Both of them very rooted in realities, both of them coming to the strong defense of private property, both predicting the calamitous results in absence of private property, and both taking on the enemies of private property in their day. So who were the enemies of private property in Aristotle's day? Well, basically it's the same people that Mises confronted. I mean, think about it, Aristotle's writing in the 4th century. So he's a student of Plato. Plato was an advocate of communism. Okay, now you can look at Plato's writings on collective ownership and communism and all the rest of it and say, oh, he was just being ironic. It's a reductio ad absurdum. He's just trying to get people to think, yada, yada, whatever. It's clear that Aristotle thought that Plato was a defender of complete communism in property and in families. Oh, I forgot one thing about Aristotle. He's a passionate defender of the private ownership of land, which he names in particular, the land as being privately owned. So anyway, so he cites Plato, his teacher, throughout in opposition to him on this subject. So whether you think Plato was playing games, or not, it doesn't really matter. Aristotle takes him for being basically a communist, advocating communist ownership of property, communist ownership of wives and children, communist ownership of land, collective ownership, central plan and dictatorship, top-down rule by philosopher kings, abolition of private life, which Plato saw was inconsistent with social harmony. So he thought that communism was the means towards social harmony. So it was Aristotle's burden to demonstrate, actually, that as well-intentioned as Plato might be, his whole scheme here would actually lead to massive social division, the abolition of benevolence, generosity, a culture of giving, and a culture of love and concern and caretaking. So that's the first group that Aristotle's taking on, are the philosophers, namely Plato, his great teacher, and his influence. He was very interested in wiping out the influence that Plato had in a rising generation of, proto-socialist philosophers. The second group, and I tried to look this up a little bit, but I came up a little bit dry, so I can't really demonstrate this, but I'm just imagining the 4th century, in the religious sense, you had an official religion, the Roman religion, which nowadays is called paganism, but it was the official state religion, and it was stable, it was pious, they had their gods, there was a god for everything, there were temples all over the place, and everybody was required to worship it. And Aristotle himself was an advocate of pious adherence to this state religion. But, in this period, and I'm basing this partly on, what I know about religious history, but as in any period, there had to have been religious crazies running around all over the place, advocating every kind of mystical dream. I know for sure that 8 centuries later, there was madness all over the land. In fact, I'm quite certain that there's no period in history where there hasn't been religious madness of some sort loose on the land. So it had to be true and 4th century Greece too. People advocating communism as a form of spiritual purification. So there's a sense in which he was taking on, the religious mystics, the same as Mises did in the 1920s. And there's a third group, namely the would-be tyrants and statesmen, which are always threatening, and in politics at all times, but particularly in Aristotle's time, there's always despotism on the loose. So he hammers this point. So what do the despots want? Well, they want to abolish private property, not because they want to bring about universal peace, but because they want to put themselves in power. He warns specifically against sort of radically democratic ideas, because he thinks that would lead to massive social chaos and massive theft of property. He warns against revolution because he says that quite often revolutions are fomented not really for the overthrow of despotism, but for the replacement of one form of injudicious, unjust leadership in favor of a kind of a dictatorship. That's what he thinks is always the result, or more or less often the result of revolution. So he's warning constantly about tyranny. In fact, if Aristotle believes that he has one theory in the book, it was an anti-tyranny book. How do you achieve a stable social order without tyranny? So he's taking them on directly and defending private property as a tool against the rise of tyranny. We don't need to go into what he calls tyranny. I mean, I think most of us would regard what Aristotle considered the ideal government as being a form of tyranny. Certainly, I think I would. But what he means by tyranny is really just a kind of a centralized system of one-man rule, where the law is entirely arbitrary, where the free men and the aristocracy do not have access to having any influence over the form of law in society. That would be for Aristotle tyranny. So you see what I'm driving at here. Oh, and by the way, Aristotle has some amazing comments in here that are just quite extraordinary. He says, what if the greater numbers of poor people, which are always greater than the number of rich, gather together to pillage all the property of the rich? Would that be just? And he has this comment. He says, if that is not injustice, it's hard to know what is. Nice, right? Then he goes further and said it would be equally unjust for the rich to gather all of their resources and all of their powers and pillage all of the poor. So that would be similarly unjust. So it's very interesting to follow his thinking here, because he's like getting close to a universalist understanding of property. I mean, he doesn't go all the way, obviously, but you can see where he's driving with this whole thing. So you can see now why I would like to make these parallels between Aristotle's politics and Mises' socialism. I mean, both of them were very strong defenders of private property. They saw that as a central institution that makes the social order work, probably the most central one, without which everything else falls apart. All human virtue, everything is destroyed. And in Aristotle's case, it's virtue, affection, love, benevolence. Even our vocabulary, our sense of ourselves is smashed in the absence of private property. For Mises, absence of private property means economic chaos, the end of efficiency, the end of economic rationality, and certainly the end of economic growth. Aristotle did not make that kind of argument because he didn't understand that economic growth was even possible, so he couldn't make that kind of argument. Nonetheless, both of them very passionate defenders of private property. However flawed Aristotle was in his understanding, at least he got that much right. And look who they were confronting. Both were confronting the same three groups of opponents of property in their time. On one hand, the academic elite. Secondly, the religious mystics and the clerical class, who imagine communism is a means towards spiritual salvation. It's true in Aristotle's time. It's true in Mises' time. And thirdly, would-be tyrants who don't like private property, who like to get rid of it as a means for acquiring more power. So it's very interesting to me to read the two parallel, because the same problems are confronting both, and they both have the same kind of answer, and they're both centered on property as the ideal solution. In our own times, of course, it remains true. I mean, who are the great opponents of private property in our time? It's still the academic elite, the religious mystics, and those who think that we're going to achieve some sort of greater virtuous state by taxing everybody or by sharing everything in common. And thirdly, always and everywhere, the tyrants who basically rail against private property as a means of gaining power and keeping power and becoming despots. Same group in Aristotle's time, Mises' time, and our time. It never changes, always the same. What's different slightly is the nature of argumentation that Mises used, that Aristotle used. And then in our own time, we have to use different types of arguments, I would say, than Mises himself did. What else to say about Mises' book? I think it repays a very close reading now. Let me just say something about Mises' own defense of property, because if he's going to make private property the central point of his book, he's got to have a good basis for it. So he talks about private property as being a technology, that it comes about to solve a particular social problem, mainly the appearance of privation. There's just not enough to go around. So people have to figure out a way to make more stuff. And the only way you can really do that is through things like domestication of animals and through raising crops. But both of which require a sense of what is mine. So you have to stake out a certain amount of land and secure it against invaders. And if you're successful in doing that, then you can seek out a community consensus that this is private. This is mine. You respect what I'm calling my private property rights. I'll respect what you call your private property rights. And it's the same thing, domestication of animals. These are my goats. I'm going to make them my goats. I'm going to call them my goats. You don't get anywhere near them. If you do, I'm going to do something bad to you. But if you do trespass, then I'm going to use all my powers to stop you. But if you don't, then I'll in turn respect your private property rights. So gradually over time, there emerges, just out of social utility, out of social necessity, a technology which we can call private property, which is really just a social consensus. This is a very important theory, and it's different from, I would say, two other perspectives. One is the sort of heavenly theory of property that Moses delivered the tablets and said, "Thou shalt not steal," and that established property rights. That property rights is somehow granted to us by the gods or by natural law, written on our hearts or something like that. Mises would say, no, it's just something we came up with to make the world work better. The other theory of property, of course, that this contradicts in a way is Locke's own theory, which is an interesting perspective that says if you mix your labor somehow with a body of land or with items around you, then that somehow establishes the rights to own them. I mean, the problem I have with this Lockean theory is that it always seems to be, there's plenty of problems with it. One of them is that it presumes some sort of third party, a judge that's already in place that can implement the theory and say, yes, that is just ownership. You can keep that because you mixed your labor with it, I mean, he sets up the standard, but the problem is the world doesn't really have such a third party neutral observer to say, oh, you've mixed your labor with it, therefore it's yours. I mean, that's just That works fine in theory, but the reality is that if your property rights are not respected in real time, you don't have them. You know, I mean, just a contemporary example that I like to give: if you leave your wallet on the trunk of your car uh, and come back at the end of the day and it's gone, you know, in what sense is that wallet really yours? I mean, you can say, well, you took my wallet. Well, that's just your perspective. But if you're unable to secure it, and there's not a social consensus that says I'm going to leave that alone and let him have it, you basically don't have private property rights. I mean, you can claim you do, but they're not real. So um, the other problem with Locke's theory is this idea of labor being the source of the generation of the existence of private property rights, which gets you into many other problems which still persist today in the theory of property, because it's not clear whether labor has anything to do with anything. If I claim a gigantic rock in front of me as my own, whether I turn that into a sculpture or not, essentially has nothing to do with whether or not my property rights in that rock are real, are realizable, enforceable, and can act upon them. I mean, it just essentially has nothing. It seems to me the whole labor aspect of Locke's theory is just a gigantic distraction. So,
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. It goes on for another 20, 25 minutes. I want to play this because it's a real look on where we are as a society today. And, you know, this is Aristotle, you know, this goes back. This isn't some new ideology. And even Aristotle still believed in a form of government, more of a democracy, but even warned against extreme democracy. And when you look at where we are now as a society, it goes against everything that makes a prosperous society, and we are making a more dependent society. And you know, there's an organization, I'm not going to name it, and I'll use this for example, and it was something that, you know, the talk about how, you know, this was going through seemed to kind of spark a little bit of kind of like, what am I doing type attitude. And a gentleman was renting a house on property, and owner had it up for sale, and it included a whole bunch of other farmland that wasn't part of the rental part. And a organization bought it. They got it really cheap somehow, but they bought it, and it was going to be a new addition. Well, this addition was going to give low-income people homes. These homes valued from like 125,000 to 150, 175,000. And so that gentleman had to move. And he was already in the process of looking to purchase a home. Works a full-time job. And, you know, he's looking at a price range of 89 to right under 100,000. That way he could keep his mortgage payments down around the high 600s. Well, these brand new homes would be given to people. Basically, how the requirements worked out, basically, if that gentleman decided, hey, let's go work part-time job, let's get my hours cut down to part-time, Because if he would do that, then he could get $150,000 home and pay around $500 a month. Now think about that. You have the option to work full time, attempt to purchase a house between 89 and let's say 99, and you're looking to spend between $650 and $750 a month on your house payment. Or you can get a brand new home for $150,000 home for $500, between $5 and $550. And there's a lot of things out there, not just that one instance. There's so much out there. That's not the only organization. You can't just go shunning one. That's why I didn't want to name them. But there's so many out there. Just basically go work part-time and you can actually enjoy more than if you're still out there working full-time, not really making that much money. With what inflation has already gotten us to. And then, also, when you get into socialism, communism, fascism, and how all this kind of is entangled, because to have socialism, you and use government for that means what you initially create is either a communist or a fascist type government, which then why socialism never works out, because they make you all equal while they'll sit up in their palaces, castles, bunker, wherever, and live their lifestyle with your money, your labor. And, when Jeffrey Tucker talks about labor, and I've kind of went into this a little bit, but labor is the value you put on it. Now, you can volunteer to do something and then also get paid to do that same thing. And it's what value you put to it. And sometimes you'll see more value in the volunteering aspect of it rather than seeking a financial aspect out of it. Be like, well, I could ask for the money, but I might be able to get to that position, or help out in my community in this way, and that might be more beneficial than taking money from that. And I don't want to shun organizations for trying to help people, but I think we need to really have a grasp on what if there's people working full time and they would have to pay $650, why would you give a brand new home? They would have to find a used home that's in that price range usually, and for it to be big enough for a family or whatever. And you want to give brand new homes to people that aren't working full time. And I understand some people can't, and that's why I don't want to shun organizations. But that's also why I tend not to donate to these organizations, because I just think there's not enough consideration for the people that are out there working. And a lot of times it's those full-time workers that are trying to, buy the under $100,000 home. That way they can afford the mortgage payment, that donate to these organizations. They might not make a big contribution, but the percentage out of what they can afford is pretty substantial. It's easy for someone to have $100 million and donate $5 grand to an organization than it is for someone that doesn't really have any money saved because their bills are pretty high to donate, 10, $20. They might skip out on, getting that coffee in the morning, just go straight to work or something to give up a $5 or something. I see it all the time, and I think that's what kind of irritates me the most is to see people that, for whatever reason, it does give a lot of these people incentive not to find a different job. They will stick at that part-time job because it put them in a situation where they can have something nicer than most people. And then, when society gets tired of it too, it becomes another fight because then you have a large group of people that are dependent on that system. And that dependency leads to basically some type of a civil war, whether it be political or a actual fight. It becomes more divisionary, and I'm seeing it in society now, where you got people that are like, this is all I've known. I have to get these benefits because, well, there's no jobs left in America, really. People are like, oh, there's jobs that Hispanics take that we don't want. And it's not that we don't want it, it's that corporations really do have a monopoly control in America. And some of it's intentional, some of it is system setup. There's a lot of companies that come up that they're just trying to compete. And they're in a system that to truly compete, you're not going to be able to pay your employees what they deserve because the monopolies that are already out there. And I think that's becoming very apparent. And that's where we get a lot of these socialists that pop up. And when they see it as, well, these corporations are capitalists, and this is what capitalism leads to. That's what corporatism leads to, and it's government that has helped that along. And you're calling for government to take more control. So all you'll do is transfer that into government hands, which will not distribute it among you. They'll give you your pennies for your dollars. I got one article I want to read real quick, kind of talking about that. If I can find it. Might have lost it. Yeah, I think I might have closed it out. But if you look at the society we're under, we have socialists that believe capitalism and freedom is the reason that these few corporations have control, and they don't understand the history of how corporations and government have worked to establish this control. You look at, Rockefeller and the oil, and how the history of, let's look at Standard Oil. Standard Oil got its monopoly, and it used corruption through government to gain that monopoly. Then it was called out. And we have to break this monopoly up. So government was involved in creating the monopoly. Then they say they're going to they tell the people that they're going to get rid of this monopoly. Well, what ends up happening is Standard Oil gets split into multiple companies, which Rockefeller still owns the stock of. So they didn't get rid of the monopoly. But what did they do? Well, because you can't create a monopoly anymore, it makes it a little bit harder for you ever to reach that level. So now Rockefeller kind of holds, in a way, a little bit of a monopoly on that. This type of ideology and this belief and this learning curve that Rockefeller used, and you can see that play out later on in a lot of things that government and big corporations or banks collaborate with. And I think it's very apparent. Now, I got some Jade Helm stuff I want to cover, but I have one quick here. Some of you might know who Nathan Cox is. He's a fellow libertarian activist, and I have an article here from FoxNews.com. $1.3 million traffic stop. Virginia State Trooper sues blogger over online claims. Nathan Cox left is being sued for $1.35 million by Virginia State Trooper Melina McKinney right after he posted a video of a heated encounter with the officer on the internet and accused her of molesting him. A self-styled police watchdog who got a $75 ticket from a Virginia State Trooper in 2012 is now facing a $1.3 million lawsuit after he posted the encounter on the internet and accused the cop of molesting him. On May 26, 2012, Memorial Day weekend, Nathan Cox of Mechanicsville, Virginia, was driving in the southbound lane of Interstate 295 just after 3 p.m. when Officer Melanie McKinney of the Virginia State Police pulled him over for failing to display his front license plate. The events that transpired next, including Cox's posting of the ordeal on his blog, Virginia Cop Block, would result in $1.35 million lawsuit against him. The traffic stop was contentious from the beginning. McKinney immediately ordered Cox, who has a concealed weapons permit, from his vehicle while Cox began recording the incident on his cell phone. It took him almost a mile before his vehicle pulled over, and of course we are always looking for things that may be unusual because you never know what you're going to get during a traffic stop, McKinney told FoxNews.com Monday. I'm approaching, looking in the windows, and he's got his back slightly towards me, and he's holding an object, she said. For my safety, I felt he needed to step out of the vehicle. The object was Cox's cell phone, which he was using to legally record the incident. After stepping from the vehicle, McKinney ordered Cox, a 33-year-old Iraq War veteran, to put the device down on the car instead of holding it over her head out of fear it could be used as a weapon. McKinney insists she wanted the phone placed on the back of Cox's car so that it could not be used as a blunt force object to strike her, not to stop him from recording. There are reports of cell phones looking like guns, said McKinney, a 12-year veteran of the Virginia State Police. I had no problem with them recording me. I was already being recorded with the dash cam. He wasn't compliant when he got out of the vehicle, she said. Cox was promptly frisked by McKinney, also had an expired inspection sticker In the end, Cox received 2 tickets from McKinney, one of them for inspection failure, which was later dismissed after he appeared in court, and another for $75 for his failure to display his front license plate. The ordeal did not sit well with Cox, who said he believes his constitutional rights were violated. Through the Freedom of Information Act, he later obtained the 28-minute dash cam video, as well as radio transmissions and text messages sent between McKinney and her colleagues, and posted it on to his blog. While sitting inside her police cruiser after the confrontation, McKinney can be heard in one radio transmission telling another officer, "I don't want myself on any YouTube or whatever." When the colleague informs her about Cox's blog, she can also be heard defending her orders to have Cox step outside his vehicle. "It took him a long time to pull over, so I just wanted him to get out of the car," she tells a colleague. "I don't want to search his car. I don't want anything like that, but I don't if he's got a gun." The YouTube video of the confrontation has been viewed more than 600,000 times to date. Cox and his blog are known to law enforcement in the area. McKinney case is not the first time Cox has been embroiled in a legal dispute over his First Amendment rights. Cox was awarded $10,000 in April 2012 from the state of Virginia for an alleged illegal traffic stop. As Cox explains it, he was driving in Richmond a year earlier when he saw a Virginia Commonwealth University police officer engaged with another vehicle on the side of the road. Cox pulled out his megaphone, which he said he uses at police demonstrations, and blasted, "Stop harassing people, we pay your paychecks." The officer then got into his vehicle with the sirens on and pulled Cox over. An incident he also recorded on a cell phone and later posted to his blog. Cox was charged with disorderly conduct, but a judge later dismissed the charge. He then hired well-known constitutional rights attorney Thomas H. Roberts, who filed a civil lawsuit against the police department. The case was settled outside of court, and Cox was issued a check by the state. McKinney first filed her lawsuit in May 2013 in small claims court for $5,000. She then refiled in March 2014 in circuit court for $1.35 million, an amount set by her attorney, D. Hayden Fisher. Cox, a libertarian who said he once wanted to be a police officer, founded in 2010 what he calls a police accountability group. "Badges don't grant extra rights," he said, telling FoxNews.com that his group's cause is to hold police accountable, require transparency, and educate people on their rights. "We are a reactive and proactive organization in the sense that if somebody gets roughed up by police, we'll organize demonstrations and bail money if need be," he said. In the McKinney case, Cox said his arms were raised over his head because within seconds of me getting out of the car, she tried to grab the cell phone out of my hand. I told her I had a personal right to record her. Roberts, who is representing Cox again, said his client's actions are protected under First Amendment, claims the lawsuit is problematic because a number of the claims are barred by the statute of limitations. The blog is protected by First Amendment to protest and to complain about the government, said Roberts. "Truth is an absolute defense against defamation," he added, referring to the video and text messages obtained by Cox. But McKinney's lawyer said it is alleged false statements made by Cox on his blog that constitute defamation, such as accusations that McKinney molested him during the traffic stop. Actually, if you frisk someone when they don't want it, that is definitionally being molested. You can look at the dash cam video and see that she did not assault him or molest him. Fisher told Fox News, if anything, she could have arrested him for causing problems. Cox defended his molestation statement, which he said in a homemade video he posted to his blog, FoxNews.com. He felt he was molested, but not sexually. She first tried to grab my phone and in doing so made unwanted contact with me. Then she did a quick pat down. Then she tried grabbing my phone some more, he said. McKinney said she was simply doing her job. We never know what we're encountering, she said. It would be different if I was a rogue officer trampling on his rights, but this is not me. I'm a professional person. I care about the community. I care about my reputation. I try to treat everyone with respect, she said. And you can find that at foxnews.com. $1.3 million traffic stop. Virginia State Trooper sues blogger over online claims. But if you look at the definition of being, molested, there's a difference between sexually molested and molested. Unwanted touching and advances is still being molested, but it's not sexually being molested. Now, people can claim, though, the frisking, they get close if they're touching, which some officers will. That would be true. I don't know. I did watch the entire thing. It's one of those things, though, that, we're not going to see the end of this right away because the police state is doing nothing more than amping up. And we have this Jade Helm going on. And I have a couple articles at least here on Jade Helm. This one from personalliberty.com. Government tries to ban us from tracking Jade Helm. Patriots step in. A citizen surveillance group says it plans to monitor Operation Jade Helm, the U.S. military's planned 7-state training exercise, as it begins throughout the Southwest on Wednesday. The grassroots surveillance movement was organized by a group calling itself Counter Jade Helm, which boasts a Facebook following of more than 6,000 people and a website filled with information about the military's plans. The Counter Jade Helm website explained the citizens initiated mission. Thusly, Counter Jade Helm, aka CJH, is a training exercise for the people in response to the military's multi-state training called Jade Helm 2015. Citizens will participate in an unofficial fashion to practice counterinsurgency, organizational and intelligence gathering, and reporting skills. CJH is not affiliated with the military training exercise. The objective is not to stop or countermand the military's training, but to practice our own skills. Anyone can participate. Groups within each state that will play host to the military are being established to streamline the process. Individuals not wishing to be affiliated with the group can also submit information to the website for analysis and publishing. National organizer Marine Pete Lantieri, 44, described by The Hill as a former Marine and a New Yorker currently living in Arizona, said that the group's main goal is to observe the military participants, what the military participants do in public. Obviously, on a military base, they can do whatever they want, Lantieri said, according to The Hill, but if they're going to train on public land, we have a right as American citizens to watch what they're doing. The Washington Post reported last week that the media will be largely prohibited from covering the military training exercises. Embedded reporters won't be permitted at any point during the exercise, in which military officials say that secretive special ops troops will maneuver through private and publicly owned land in several southern states. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Lastoria, a spokesman for the Army Spec Ops Command, said his organization is considering allowing a small number of journalists to view selected portions of the exercise later this summer, but nothing is finalized. That means counter Jade Helm participants like Texas surveillance team leader Eric Johnston, a 51-year-old retired firefighter and sheriff's deputy, will be the primary source of public information about the military's actions. According to Houston's Crown, Johnston will coordinate 30 groups of volunteers, about 20 folks in total, who hope to monitor the SEALs, Green Berets, and Air Force Special Ops in Bastrop, Big Spring, and Junction. If a team member sees two Humvees full of soldiers driving through town, they're going to follow them, Johnston told local reporters, and they're going to radio back their ultimate location. Johnston said that one of his team members is a licensed pilot who plans to conduct aerial surveillance of the military maneuvers. The citizen response to Jade Helm mirrors Republican Texas Governor Greg Abbott's April decision to mobilize his state guard to observe the U.S. military's planned training exercise in Texas after hundreds of residents relayed concern about Jade Helm. During the training operation, it is important that Texans know their safety, constitutional rights, private property rights, and civil liberties will not be infringed, he said in a statement at the time. But by monitoring the operation on a continual basis, the State Guard will facilitate communications between my office and the commanders of the operation to ensure that adequate measures are in place to protect Texans. Americans and some lawmakers skeptical of Jade Helm exercises have at times been ridiculed by the mainstream media and political establishment, but amid intense Jade Helm secrecy and increasing federal power in recent years, people leery of the training event represent a sizable percentage of likely U.S. voters. Rasmussen noted in May, 45% of voters are concerned that the government will use U.S. military training operations to impose greater control over some states, with 19% who are very concerned. That's how personalliberty.com. Now I have another one here. This one out of the statesman.com. Statesman, not the, but just statesman.com. 2 men kicked out of Camp Swift say everything looks normal. Bastrop, 1:45 p.m. update. 2 men who said they are in Bastrop to document Jade Helm 15 drove through Camp Swift on Wednesday and were escorted out. The 2 Derek Bros of Houston and Mark Jenkins of Round Rock said they saw nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for a National Guard post. More generally, Jenkins said, standing in the parking lot across from the post entrance, we just thought we would come out and see what's going on, as opposed to having people tell us what's going on and tell us the United Nations is coming in or something like that. Bros, who has a blog and a book titled The Conscious Resistance, said he does not believe the conspiracy theories about Jade Helm, but he said he thinks civilian documentation is important to quell fears founded in what he considers excess militarization of law enforcement and surveillance of the civilian population. There's a perfectly legitimate reason for people to fear their government will see them as the enemy, he said. Earlier, Jade Helm 15 began quietly in Bastrop today, and aside from usual convoys and National Guard tanks, and at Camp Swift, there were little sign of the special operations training exercises that set the internet afire, or the volunteers vowing to monitor it. We, for lack of a better term, are performing a neighborhood watch over Jade Helm exercise, said Eric Johnston, who is coordinating the Texas chapter of Counter Jade Helm, which our article talked about that. He said, though he does not believe any such theories, he attended the April County Commissioners meeting at which Army Lieutenant Colonel Mark Lastoria spent 2 hours fielding questions about the operation to a crowd that did not believe his answers. Johnson said that quite a few things he stated in that briefing did not add up. For instance, Johnson said Lastoria said the operation would partly involve seeing if the troops could successfully infiltrate the population. He also said they would be wearing military uniforms with bright orange armbands and would be little noticed, if at all. It is physically impossible to infiltrate the population wearing an army uniform and bright orange armband, Johnson said. So, even though Eric Burroughs might have not seen anything, I think that if they're doing these special operations, they're going to be dressed as civilians, carrying maybe a book bag or something, just acting suspicious to see if they get caught. If you get noticed. So I don't think you're going to end up seeing it. Okay. I have roughly about 8 minutes left in the broadcast. If anybody wants to call in, the okay. Looks like we lost connection there for a second. I hope I'm back on. Okay. Again, if you want to call in, feel free to call in. But before we come to the end of the broadcast, I do want to remind everybody to check out the UCY store. If you go to ucy.tv, click the UCY store tab. And UCY partnered with Amazon to bring you some great prepping, camping, radiation preparation gear that's out there at the same great prices you can find on Amazon with the same shipping rates and all that. And at the same time, you're helping UCY. They get a little bit of kickback to help operating costs. And it's one of the best collections I've seen of prepping gear, and I say this every time because it really is a wide selection of radiation prepping gear and camping gear if you just want to go camping. So definitely go check them out, ucy.tv. Click the UCY store tab. Okay. Now, one thing that I think that we really need to be paying attention to, not only the Jade Helm stuff, not only the Iran stuff, not only Donald Trump, this whole BS election where they're flooding the Republican field to make sure that even people like Rand Paul won't get the nomination. They buried his name, basically. It's almost like he already dropped out of the race. Don't it seem? Rand Paul, they did it to your dad, too. So if people go, he's just playing the game that way, he'll get the, well, there. You can't trust them. Should have known. If you can't trust them, how are you going to play their game? They'll use you and spit you out. Oh, you want to run for office, huh, Rand? Yeah. Thanks for helping us out, but yeah, that's not going to happen. And they are throwing him under the bus. And I'm not a big Rand Paul supporter. I think he's probably the best bet out of the field. But again, I don't pick, the best of the worst. I don't agree with a lot of what he has said, and I don't know where to trust him on certain issues, and therefore, just like most politicians, I just kind of checked out of that. Okay, doesn't look like we're getting any callers. Now, talking about conspiracy theory, there's one out, and I don't know if it's theory, but this one from the dollarvigilante.com. Most of you might know Jeff Berwick. Shimada exposed financial crisis plan for September 2015. There is a video here that there's not enough time, of course, but I really want people to go check it out. And I'll probably cover this Friday. And so you could call in when I cover this Friday, but I want to know what people think on this. So Shimada exposed financial crisis plan for September 2015. Check it out. It's a short clip. You can probably just go to YouTube, find it, or go to dollarvigilante.com and search for it too. And there's something going on, that there's a large shift of powers. And there's so many different conspiracy theories out there, it kind of even distorts the truth. And that's where we try to wiggle our way through. What's going on? Do they plan for an invasion, or are they going to start something, or do they plan on an uprising, or economic collapse? You know, where are the cards landing? And that's really basically what it is. People are like, well, you know, if this doesn't collapse by this time, I'm not going to care anymore. That's not the thing. Is a lot of people think, oh, you're a fearmonger because you're warning us something and then it don't happen. No, I'm warning of the condition we're in. And like I've said multiple times too, is if we don't have a complete collapse, we already know just from our history that we're still headed in the wrong direction. Your dollar in your pocket is going to be worth less tomorrow and the day after and the day after. There might always be that little inflation bubble that makes your money also worth a little bit more for a split second, and then, oh, yep, all prices follow suit. And it doesn't help the economy when all this happens. We have banksters printing our money, and we can't audit them. We have so much tyranny and lies coming from government that even if government tries to do something legit, and I've even used this with the talk about law enforcement, even if they do right, there's so much corruption that they're no longer believable. Even if you have a good cop in law enforcement, when there's a large amount of corruption, the good cops can't really do anything about it. Guess what? The public's not going to trust you, good cops, unless you're very outspoken and publicly involved. And I think in the long run, too, that might back you up from being fired or attacked by the corrupt law enforcement that you might be trying to expose. Okay, we're coming up to the end of the broadcast. Again, I want everybody to go check out the UCY store, ucy.tv. Click the UCY store tab, and that helps UCY out. And also go and check out My Patriot Supply. If you go to Anti-Tyranny News